A rancher's prize stallion vanished into the desert night. When it returned at dawn, it carried something that would change his life forever, an Apache woman clinging to its mane, half dead from thirst, with eyes that held secrets the desert had kept buried for years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Texas Panhandle in late August was a furnace with no mercy. Heat shimmered off the red clay like spirits rising from the earth, and the air itself seemed to burn when drawn into the lungs. Malcolm Garrett stood at the fence line of his ranch, squinting against the brutal sun that had turned the horizon into liquid gold. His hand rested on weathered wood, fingers drumming an anxious rhythm he didn't realize he was making. The corral stood empty. The gate hung open, swinging slightly in the hot wind that offered no relief. Only the smell of dust and dried mesquite. Thunder was gone. The black stallion had been with Malcolm for 7 years, since the horse was barely more than a colt, with legs too long for its body and a wild spirit that refused breaking. Malcolm had gentled him with patience instead of force, spending months earning trust that most men would have beaten into submission. That horse had become more than livestock, more than transportation. In the loneliness of ranch life, Thunder had become companionship. Now the corral stood empty, and Malcolm felt the hollow ache of loss settling in his chest like a stone. He had checked the gate 3 times before bed. He was certain of it. The latch was secure, the posts solid. Yet sometime in the night, between the last check and dawn's first light, Thunder had disappeared. The tracks leading away from the corral told a story Malcolm couldn't quite piece together. Hoofprints heading east toward the open desert, but no signs of struggle, no broken fence rails, nothing to suggest theft or panic. The horse had simply walked away, as though called by something Malcolm couldn't hear. Behind him, the ranch house stood silent and austere, its adobe walls thick enough to keep out the worst of the heat, but never quite cool. Malcolm had built it himself over the course of 2 brutal summers, laying each brick with hands that bled and blistered. It was meant to be a home for a family, but his wife Sarah had died of fever 3 winters past, and the rooms now echoed with absence. He lived alone, ate alone, worked the land alone. The ranch stretched across 500 acres of stubborn earth that yielded just enough to keep him fed, and the livestock watered. It wasn't prosperity, but it was survival, and Malcolm had learned to measure success in smaller increments since Sarah's death. The neighboring ranches were miles away in every direction. The nearest town, Redemption Flats, was a half-day's ride south, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single dusty street. Malcolm went there only when supplies ran low, or when winter's isolation became too heavy to bear alone. He was known there as a fair man, quiet but honest, the kind who paid his debts and didn't start trouble. But he kept his distance. Grief had taught him that solitude was easier than sympathy. Malcolm walked the perimeter of the corral, studying the ground with the careful eye of a man who had tracked cattle through brush and coyotes through moonlight. The hoofprints were clear in the dust, heading due east. No other tracks accompanied them, no boot prints, no signs of another horse. Thunder had left alone. The desert stretched endlessly in that direction, a vast expanse of rock and sand, punctuated by saguaro cacti standing like silent sentinels. Beyond that lay the territories where Apache bands still moved. Though their numbers had dwindled and treaties had been signed and broken so many times, the paper meant nothing. Malcolm had never had trouble with the Apache. He left them alone and they left him alone. His ranch sat on the edge of what had once been their land, and he was respectful enough not to forget that. Still, the thought of Thunder wandering into those territories unsettled him. A horse like that would be valuable to anyone, settler or Apache alike. The sun climbed higher, pressing down like a physical weight. Malcolm returned to the house and gathered supplies. A canteen, dried beef, his rifle, and a length of rope. He saddled Dancer, the older mare he used for longer rides, and checked the straps twice. The mare was steady and reliable, if not as fast as Thunder. she would have to do. Before mounting, Malcolm paused at the porch and looked back at the ranch. Leaving it unattended even for a day carried risks. Cattle could wander, fences could fail, and the land demanded constant vigilance. But Thunder was out there somewhere, and Malcolm couldn't let him go without trying to bring him home. He swung into the saddle and turned Dancer east, following the tracks that cut through the red dust like a trail of breadcrumbs leading into the unknown. The ride was slow and methodical. Malcolm kept his eyes on the ground, tracking the hoofprints as they wound through scrub brush and over rocky outcroppings. The land rose and fell in gentle swells, each crest revealing more desert stretching endlessly ahead. The heat was relentless, turning his shirt dark with sweat and forcing him to ration water carefully. Hours passed. The sun reached its apex and began its slow descent toward the western horizon. The tracks remained clear, unwavering in their eastward direction. Thunder was moving with purpose, not wandering aimlessly. That troubled Malcolm more than he wanted to admit. Horses didn't just leave. Something had drawn the stallion away. By late afternoon, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to rougher terrain, scattered with boulders and shallow arroyos carved by flash floods that came once or twice a year with violent suddenness. The tracks led into one of these dry riverbeds, and Malcolm dismounted to study them more closely. Here, the hoofprints were joined by something else. Footprints, human and bare, small enough to belong to a woman or a young person. They were faint, barely visible in the sandy bottom of the arroyo, but unmistakable once Malcolm's eyes adjusted to the patterns. Someone had been walking alongside Thunder, or perhaps the horse had been following them. Malcolm's hand instinctively moved to the rifle strapped to his saddle. He wasn't a violent man, but the desert demanded caution. He remounted and continued forward, following the arroyo as it twisted between high banks of red stone. The sun was sinking fast now, painting the desert in shades of orange and deep purple. Shadows stretched long and dark, pooling in the low places. Malcolm knew he would have to make camp soon, but something drove him forward, a feeling he couldn't name. A pull as strong as the one that must have led Thunder away. Then, just as the last light began to fade, he saw it, a figure, small and still, lying crumpled at the base of a boulder. And standing over it, head lowered as if keeping watch, was Thunder. The black stallion lifted his head as Malcolm approached, ears pricked forward, but he didn't bolt. He stood his ground, protective and calm. Malcolm dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Thunder nickered softly, a sound of recognition, but his attention remained fixed on the figure at his feet. Malcolm approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, details emerged from the twilight. It was a woman, her body thin and battered, her clothing torn and dusty. Her skin was sun-darkened, her long black hair tangled with burrs and dirt. She lay motionless, one hand still loosely gripping Thunder's reins, as though she had held on until her strength finally gave out. Malcolm knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse, faint but steady, fluttered beneath his touch. She was alive, but barely. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her face gaunt with dehydration. She'd been out here for days, maybe longer. He reached for his canteen and carefully tilted a few drops of water onto her lips. She didn't stir. He tried again, a little more this time, and her throat moved reflexively, swallowing. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Thunder stood nearby, watching with an intelligence that sent a chill down Malcolm's spine. The horse had brought him here. Somehow, impossibly, the stallion had led him to this woman. Malcolm looked around at the empty desert, the darkening sky, and the woman lying unconscious at his feet. He had come out here looking for his horse. Instead, he had found something, someone else entirely, and as the first stars began to pierce the deepening blue above, Malcolm realized that his solitary life, so carefully constructed around grief and routine, was about to be shattered in ways he couldn't yet imagine. He lifted the woman carefully, her body light as a child's in his arms, and carried her to Dancer. Thunder followed without being led, staying close as though his task was not yet finished. Malcolm didn't know who she was, where she had come from, or why Thunder had brought him to her. But as he secured her across the saddle and turned his horses toward home, one thing was certain: the desert had given him a mystery. And Malcolm Garrett was not the kind of man who left mysteries unsolved. The journey back began, under a sky now thick with stars, and with each mile, the weight of what he carried grew heavier, not in body, but in consequence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ride back to the ranch stretched through the night like a fever dream. Malcolm kept Dancer at a steady pace, careful not to jostle the unconscious woman draped across the saddle. Thunder followed close behind, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. The stallion had never been one to stray, yet he had walked miles into the desert, as if summoned by something beyond Malcolm's understanding. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver across the landscape and turning every shadow into something that moved. Malcolm's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Who was this woman? Had she been alone out there, or were there others searching for her? And most troubling of all, how had Thunder found her? The stars wheeled overhead as the hours passed. Malcolm stopped twice to give the woman more water, tilting the canteen to her cracked lips with a gentleness that surprised him. Each time, her throat moved in response, but her eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow. She was holding on, but barely. Dawn was breaking when the ranch finally appeared on the horizon, the adobe walls catching the first rays of light. Malcolm felt exhaustion pulling at his bones, but relief surged through him at the sight of home. He urged Dancer forward, and Thunder quickened his pace as well. As though the horses too sensed sanctuary ahead, Malcolm carried the woman inside, pushing open the door with his shoulder and laying her carefully on the wooden bench near the hearth. The house was cool from the night, the thick walls having absorbed the chill. He lit a lamp, and warm light spilled across the room, illuminating her face for the first time in full clarity. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, though hardship had etched lines around her eyes that spoke of suffering beyond her years. Her features were striking: high cheekbones, a strong jaw, skin bronzed by sun and heritage. Her clothing, what remained of it, was traditional Apache, a torn deerskin dress, moccasins worn through at the soles, and beaded jewelry that caught the lamplight. Malcolm fetched clean water from the well and a cloth from the cupboard. He dampened it and carefully cleaned the dust and dried blood from her face and hands. Her skin was burning with fever, and he could see cuts and bruises covering her arms. She had been through something terrible. He prepared a broth from dried beef and vegetables, letting it simmer on the stove until the smell filled the small house. When it was ready, he spooned small amounts into her mouth, waiting patiently as her body responded instinctively, swallowing without waking. It was all he could do for now. Malcolm moved her to his own bed, the only proper one in the house, and covered her with clean blankets. He pulled a chair beside the bed and sat watching her breathe, studying the rise and fall of her chest as if he could will strength into her lungs. His own exhaustion threatened to pull him under, but he fought it, unwilling to leave her alone. As morning light strengthened through the window, Malcolm finally allowed himself to doze, his head dropping forward, his body folding in the chair. Sleep came in fragments, disturbed by dreams of thunder galloping through endless desert, of shadows moving in the darkness, of a woman's voice calling words he couldn't understand. He woke to find the woman's eyes open, staring at him. Malcolm jerked upright, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle leaning against the wall. But the woman didn't move. She simply watched him with eyes the color of dark honey, alert despite the fever that still flushed her cheeks. There was no fear in her gaze, but there was wariness, the careful assessment of someone who had learned to measure threat in the space of a heartbeat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Malcolm's heart hammered in his chest, not from fear, but from the intensity of her stare. It felt as though she were looking through him, reading something written in a language he didn't know he carried. "You're safe here," Malcolm said finally, his voice rough from sleep and dust. "I found you in the desert. You were dying." The woman's eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the sparse furniture, the cooking stove, the windows showing landscape beyond. Her gaze returned to Malcolm, and she spoke a single word in a language he didn't understand. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Malcolm shook his head. "I don't speak Apache, but you're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to leave." He gestured to the water pitcher on the bedside table. "Drink. You need it." She studied him for another long moment before reaching for the pitcher with trembling hands. Malcolm moved to help her, but she pulled back sharply, nearly spilling the water. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace and stepped away, giving her space. She drank deeply, water spilling down her chin in her desperation. When the pitcher was empty, she set it down and closed her eyes, her body sagging with exhaustion from even that small effort. "My name is Malcolm," he said quietly. "Malcolm Garrett. This is my ranch." Her eyes opened again, fixing on him with that same penetrating stare. She spoke another word, this one clearer. It sounded like Nalin, though Malcolm couldn't be certain. He took it as her name and nodded. "Nalin," he repeated, and something flickered in her eyes, acknowledgement perhaps, or surprise that he would try. The day passed in strange silence. Nalin slept for long stretches, waking only to drink water or accept the broth Malcolm prepared. He changed the bandages on her wounds, noting with concern the deep gashes on her side and the rope burns on her wrists. Someone had tied her. Someone had hurt her. Malcolm worked around the ranch, tending to the animals and checking fences, but his thoughts kept returning to the woman in his bed. What had happened to her? Where had she come from? And why had thunder led him to her? By evening, Nalin's fever had broken. Malcolm found her sitting up when he returned from the corral, her back against the wall, her eyes tracking him as he entered. She looked stronger, though still fragile, like glass that had been cracked but not yet shattered. He set a plate of bread and beans on the table. "You should eat." She regarded the food with suspicion before slowly rising from the bed. Her movements were careful, pained, but she made it to the table and sat. Malcolm took the chair across from her, giving her space, and watched as she ate with the intensity of someone who had forgotten what fullness felt like. When she finished, she looked at him directly and spoke in halting English. "Why, you help?" Malcolm was startled to hear his own language, broken though it was. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "White men." Not help Apache. There was no accusation in her voice, only statement of fact. Malcolm felt the weight of history pressing between them. Years of broken treaties, violence, displacement. He couldn't argue with her observation. He had seen enough to know the truth of it. "I'm not most white men," he said quietly. Nalin's expression remained unreadable, but she nodded slowly. "The Black Horse. He is yours?" "Thunder, yes. He came to me," she said, her English improving as she found the words. "In the desert. I was walking, no water, no food, many days. He came, I thought. Spirit sent him." Malcolm leaned forward, his curiosity sharpening. "How did you end up out there?" Her face darkened, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice low and hard. "Soldiers. They came to our camp. Said we must go to reservation. My father, he is chief. He refused. They took me. Said they would make him obey." Malcolm's jaw tightened. He had heard stories of such things, tactics meant to force compliance through cruelty. "How did you escape?" "Ma." "They were careless, drunk. I ran. They followed for a time, then stopped. I walked many days. The horse found me." Her eyes met his. "He brought me to you, Thunder." The horse had done more than wander off. He had found someone who needed saving and brought her to the one person who might help. Malcolm didn't believe in spirits or signs, but even he couldn't explain what had happened as mere coincidence. "Your father," Malcolm said carefully. "Where is your tribe now?" "North in the mountains, but I cannot go back." "The soldiers." "They watch. If I return, they will come for all of us." The implications settled over Malcolm like a heavy blanket. Harboring a fugitive Apache woman would bring trouble of a kind he had carefully avoided his entire life. The army didn't look kindly on those who interfered with their policies, no matter how brutal those policies might be. And the townspeople of Redemption Flats had their own opinions about Indians, most of them uncharitable. But as Malcolm looked at Naylin, at the scars on her wrists and the hollow look in her eyes, he found he didn't care about the consequences. Sarah would have helped her without question, and maybe in some way this was a chance to do something that mattered beyond the daily grind of survival. "You can stay here," Malcolm said. "As long as you need to." Nalin's expression shifted, surprise breaking through her careful mask. "You let me stay?" "Yes, why?" Malcolm considered the question. He could say it was because Thunder had brought her, or because he couldn't turn away someone in need, or because loneliness had hollowed him out enough that even dangerous company was better than none. All of those things were true. Instead, he said, because it's the right thing to do. Nalin studied him for a long moment, and something in her gaze softened. Not trust, that would take time, but perhaps the beginning of belief that not all white men were the same. "I will work," she said firmly. "I'm not burden." "You're healing," Malcolm replied. "Work and wait." But even as he said it, he knew she wouldn't listen. Pride, he was learning, was something they both carried in equal measure. That night, Malcolm made a bed for himself on the floor near the hearth, while Naylin took the bedroom. He lay awake, listening to the sounds of the desert through the open window. The distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of wind through mesquite, the steady breathing of a woman who had survived what should have killed her. He thought about Thunder, standing guard over her in the desert, about the strange chain of events that had brought them all together. And he wondered what price he would eventually pay for opening his door to someone the world had decided didn't belong. Outside, Thunder stood in the corral, his dark shape silhouetted against the starlit sky. The stallion turned his head toward the house, as if listening, as if keeping watch over something precious, and in that moment, Malcolm understood that whatever was coming, trouble, danger, judgment, he would face it. Because some things mattered more than safety. Some things were worth the risk. The desert wind whispered secrets through the darkness, and inside the small adobe ranch house, two damaged souls began the tentative work of learning to trust again. 3 days passed before Nalin ventured outside. Malcolm woke to find the bedroom empty, and his heart seized with panic until he spotted her through the window, standing in the yard with her hand outstretched toward Thunder. The stallion lowered his massive head, allowing her to touch his muzzle, and Malcolm watched something pass between them, a recognition that went beyond words. He stepped onto the porch, the morning sun already hot against his skin. Nalin turned at the sound, her body tensing instinctively before she recognized him. She was still too thin, her movements careful, as though testing the limits of her healing body, but color had returned to her cheeks. "He remembers me," she said, her English smoother now after days of listening to Malcolm speak. Horses have long memories. Malcolm walked closer, keeping his movements slow and predictable. "Especially Thunder. He's particular about who he trusts." Nalin stroked the stallion's neck, her fingers finding the rhythm horses loved. "In my language we call horses god dogs. They are sacred. This one," she paused, searching for words. "This one has strong medicine." Malcolm didn't know about medicine or spirits, but he couldn't argue with what he'd witnessed. Thunder had done something impossible, and standing here, watching the connection between horse and woman, he felt the edges of his rational world softening. "You should be resting," he said. "Though without force, I have rested enough." Naylin's jaw set with determination, Malcolm was beginning to recognize. "You said I could work." "I will work." There was no point in arguing. Malcolm had learned that much already. Instead, he showed her the well, the chicken coop where a dozen hens scratched and clucked, and the vegetable garden he'd been neglecting since Sarah died. Nalin moved through these spaces with quiet efficiency, absorbing information without needing repetition. By midday, she had collected eggs, drawn water, and was kneeling in the garden pulling weeds with methodical precision. Malcolm worked on mending harnesses in the barn, but his eyes kept drifting to her figure, bent among the rows of struggling tomato plants and squash vines. She worked differently than Sarah had, more connected to the earth somehow, her hands moving with reverence rather than mere practicality. When she found a beetle on a leaf, she didn't crush it, but relocated it to the scrub beyond the garden fence. When she watered the plants, she murmured words in Apache that Malcolm couldn't understand, but that sounded like prayers. That evening, Nalin cooked. Malcolm protested at first, but she silenced him with a look that reminded him of the iron-willed women he'd known growing up. She used the dried meat and vegetables from his stores, but transformed them into something entirely different, adding wild herbs she'd gathered from around the property and cooking methods he didn't recognize. The result was a stew unlike anything Malcolm had tasted, rich and complex with flavors that seemed to tell a story. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin bowls and the distant howl of coyotes claiming the dusk. "My mother taught me," Nalin said suddenly. "She said food is not just for hunger, it is for healing. For remembering." Malcolm set down his spoon. "What do you remember when you cook?" Her eyes grew distant. "My family, my sisters, the mountains where we hunted deer, the river where we caught fish, the ceremonies." She paused, her voice dropping. "Everything they are trying to take from us." The weight of her words settled between them. Malcolm had read newspaper accounts of the Indian Wars, of reservations and relocations, but those stories had been abstract, distant tragedies happening to people he didn't know. Now one of those people sat across his table, and the tragedy had a face, a voice and hands scarred from survival. "Your father," Malcolm said carefully. "The chief. What's his name? Goyakla. White men call him by another name. But that is not important now." She met his eyes. "What is important is that he will not surrender. And because of this, my people will suffer." Malcolm heard both pride and grief in her voice. "You don't agree with his choice?" "I agree with his heart. Our land was promised to us. The treaties were made, but promises from white men." She shook her head. "They blow away like dust. My father fights for what is right, but right does not stop bullets. Right does not feed children. When the buffalo are gone," her wisdom cut, deeper than any sermon Malcolm had heard in Redemption Flats. The situation was impossible. A people caught between principle and survival, fighting a tide that couldn't be turned back. And here he was, sheltering a woman who represented everything his neighbors feared and hated. The next morning brought the first sign of trouble. Malcolm was checking the fence line when he spotted dust rising from the south, riders approaching at a steady pace. His stomach tightened. He rode back quickly, finding Nalin hanging laundry on the line he'd strung between two posts. "Inside," he said sharply. "Now, don't let them see you." Nalin's eyes widened, but she didn't question. She gathered the wet clothes and disappeared into the house. Malcolm watched until the door closed, then turned to face the approaching riders. There were 3 of them, led by Sheriff Thomas Brennan, a thick-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that missed nothing. Beside him rode his deputy, a young man named Carter Mills, who wore his badge like it might disappear if he didn't keep checking for it. The 3rd rider was someone Malcolm didn't recognize, a lean man in a dust-covered cavalry uniform with lieutenant's bars on his shoulders. They pulled up at the fence, and Brennan touched his hat brim in greeting. "Malcolm, didn't expect to find you home. Thought you'd be out working the herd." "Lost a horse few days back," Malcolm said evenly. "Been dealing with that? What brings you all the way out here, Tom?" The sheriff exchanged a glance with the lieutenant before answering. "This here is Lieutenant Daniel Hawkins from Fort Richardson. He's looking for someone who might have passed through these parts." Hawkins urged his horse forward, his gaze sweeping the ranch with military precision. "We're tracking an Apache woman who escaped from our custody a week ago. She's dangerous, killed one of my men during the escape." Malcolm kept his face neutral, though his pulse quickened. "Haven't seen any Apache around here. Just coyotes and rattlesnakes. She's on foot, likely starving and desperate." Hawkins' voice was clipped official. "If she shows up, you're required by territorial law to report it immediately. Harboring a fugitive, especially an Indian, carries serious consequences. I understand the law." Lieutenant Brennan shifted in his saddle, his tone more conciliatory than the soldiers. "Look, Malcolm, nobody thinks you'd do anything stupid. But we gotta check every ranch, every homestead. Just doing our duty. You're welcome to look around, Malcolm said, gesturing toward the barn and outbuildings. But I've got nothing to hide. The three men dismounted and began a perfunctory search. Malcolm's heart hammered as they checked the barn, the shed, even peered into the chicken coop. But they didn't enter the house, and after 15 minutes they remounted. Appreciate your cooperation, Brennan said. If you do see anything, tracks, signs, whatever, you send word to town immediately. Understood? Understood. Lieutenant Hawkins leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes hard. That woman is property of the United States Army, Garrett. She's leverage we need to bring her father's band to heel. If I find out someone's been helping her. He left the threat hanging. Like I said, haven't seen her. The riders turned south, kicking up dust as they rode away. Malcolm stood, motionless, until they disappeared over the ridge, then released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands were shaking. Inside the house, he found Nalin pressed against the wall beside the window, a kitchen knife clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, her eyes wild. They're gone, Malcolm said softly. She didn't lower the knife. The soldier, Hawkins, he is the one who took me. He is the one who... She couldn't finish, but the horror in her eyes completed the sentence. Malcolm felt rage bloom in his chest, hot and sudden. He won't touch you again. I promise you that. You cannot promise. Nalin's voice shook. He will come back. He will search again. And when he finds me, he won't find you. You heard him. I am property. A tool to use against my father. She finally lowered the knife, her whole body trembling. You should let me go. Before they discover you helped me. Before they destroy you. Malcolm crossed the room and took the knife gently from her hands. I'm not letting you go. And I'm not letting them take you. Why? The word came out as a cry. Why would you risk everything for me? You don't know me. You owe me nothing. Maybe not, Malcolm said. But I know what's right. And handing you over to men who treat people like property, that ain't it. Nalin stared at him, tears spilling down her cheeks. They were the first tears he'd seen from her, and they spoke of exhaustion deeper than physical weariness. She was tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being strong when strength seemed pointless. Malcolm did something he hadn't done since Sarah died. He reached out and pulled Nalin into an embrace, letting her cry against his shoulder while her body shook with sobs that sounded like they'd been locked away for years. They stood that way as sunlight moved across the floor, as shadows lengthened and the day aged toward evening. And when Nalin finally stepped back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, something had shifted between them. The wariness had thinned, replaced by the fragile beginnings of genuine trust. Thank you, she whispered. Malcolm nodded, not trusting his own voice. That night they sat on the porch as stars emerged one by one across the vast Texas sky. Thunder and Dancer stood quiet in the corral, and somewhere in the darkness a nightbird sang. The danger hadn't passed, it had only been delayed. But for this moment, there was peace, and in that peace, Malcolm realized he was no longer alone in the way he had been. The house no longer echoed with absence. It hummed with life, with purpose, with the presence of someone who needed him as much as he was beginning to realize he needed her. The path ahead was treacherous, lined with threats both known and unknown. But as Malcolm glanced at Nalin's profile silhouetted against the starlight, he knew he would walk that path. Whatever the cost, the weeks that followed formed a strange rhythm. Malcolm rose before dawn to complete his work quickly, allowing Nalin to remain hidden during daylight hours when riders might pass by. She transformed the interior of his home with small touches, wildflowers in a chipped cup on the table, herbs hanging to dry from the rafters, and a carved wooden bowl she'd made from a fallen cottonwood branch, using only his knife and patient hours. The ranch itself began to flourish in ways Malcolm hadn't seen since Sarah's death. The garden exploded with growth under Nalin's careful tending, producing more vegetables than he'd managed in 3 years. She showed him which wild plants were edible, which had healing properties, and which would kill a man if consumed. The land Malcolm had viewed as harsh and unforgiving became, through her eyes, a pantry of abundance, but paradise built on secrets cannot stand forever. Malcolm rode into Redemption Flats on a Saturday to purchase supplies. The town sprawled along a single main street, its buildings weathered grey by sun and sand. The general store stood at the centre, flanked by a saloon, a livery, and a church whose white paint was perpetually losing its battle with dust. He hitched Dancer outside Crawford's general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. Isaiah Crawford looked up from behind the counter, his round face splitting into a smile. "Malcolm Garrett. Been near a month since we've seen you. Starting to think the desert swallowed you whole. Been busy with the ranch," Malcolm said, pulling out his list. "Need these supplies when you have a moment." Crawford took the paper, his eyes scanning the items. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a pause that lasted a heartbeat too long. "That's a fair amount of food for one man. You expecting company?" Malcolm kept his voice casual. "Stocking up before summer hits full force. Rather not make the trip more than necessary." "Smart thinking." Crawford began gathering items from the shelves. "Course, with the Apache trouble brewing, folks are laying in supplies for different reasons. Army's been through 3 times this month, searching every barn and shed. So I heard. They're particularly interested in anyone who might be helping that woman who escaped. Lieutenant Hawkins has offered a substantial reward for information leading to her capture." Crawford set a bag of flour on the counter with more force than necessary. $50. That's a lot of money for a simple ranch hand or shopkeeper. Malcolm met his eyes steadily. "It is, though I imagine it would be hard money to spend if you had to live with yourself afterward." Crawford's expression hardened. "Some folks might say harboring a fugitive Apache is the thing a man couldn't live with. Especially given what her people have done. What have they done, Isaiah? Defended their land? Refused to starve on reservations? They've killed settlers. Burned homesteads. You want to defend that?" Malcolm leaned against the counter, his voice low but firm. "I want to question whether a scared woman running for her life is the same as a war party. But I can see you've already made up your mind." The shopkeeper's jaw worked as he continued assembling the supplies. The transaction completed in tense silence. Malcolm paid, loaded his purchases onto Dancer, and turned to leave when a voice called out behind him. "Garrett!" "Hold up a minute." Sheriff Brennan emerged from the saloon, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He crossed the street with the unhurried gait of a man who knew his authority didn't need to be rushed. "Tom." Malcolm greeted him with a nod. "Been meaning to ride out your way again, but duty keeps me pinned to town." Brennan's eyes were shrewd beneath his hat brim. "How's everything at the ranch?" "Quiet, the way I prefer it." Good. The sheriff pulled out a pouch of tobacco and began rolling a cigarette with practiced ease. "Thing is, Malcolm, I've known you a long time. Known your family since you were knee-high. Your daddy was a good man, and everyone knows you've had a rough patch since losing Sarah." Malcolm said nothing, waiting for the real conversation to begin. "What I'm saying is, folks around here care about you. And when someone starts buying double the supplies they usually need, starts avoiding town, keeps to himself more than usual." Brennan lit his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Well, it raises questions. I'm not doing anything illegal, Tom. Didn't say you were. But if you were, hypothetically speaking, the smart thing would be to come to me before Lieutenant Hawkins comes to you. Military justice doesn't allow for the kind of understanding that civilian law does." Malcolm held the sheriff's gaze. "I appreciate the concern, but there's nothing to understand. I'm just a rancher trying to get by." Brennan studied him for a long moment, smoke curling between them. Finally he nodded. "All right then. But Malcolm, if that changes, my door's open. Day or night." The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual, Malcolm's mind churning. Crawford's suspicion and Brennan's warning meant the walls were closing in. It was only a matter of time before someone decided to investigate more thoroughly. He found Narlin in the garden, her hands dark with soil, a basket of squash at her feet. She looked up at his approach and immediately sensed his tension. "What happened?" Malcolm dismounted and told her about the conversations, watching her face close off with each detail. When he finished, she stood and brushed dirt from her hands. "I will leave tonight. I have stayed too long already." "No. Malcolm, you heard what they said. They are watching. They suspect. If I stay, they will come for both of us." "Where will you go?" Malcolm demanded. "Back into the desert? You nearly died out there once already. And if you go north to find your people, Hawkins will be watching every trail. He wants you specifically, Narlin, not just any Apache. You!" Her face twisted with anguish. "Then what do you suggest? That I hide here forever while you lie to everyone you know? While you risk everything you have built? If that's what it takes, that is not a life. For either of us!" Her words hung in the air between them, raw and true. Malcolm felt the frustration building in his chest, at the situation, at the injustice, at his own helplessness to fix any of it. "Then we figure out another way," he said finally. "But running isn't it?" "Not yet." That evening they sat at the table in heavy silence, picking at food neither had appetite for. The lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls, and outside the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Narlin spoke first, her voice quiet. "In my tribe, there is a story about the coyote and the eagle. The coyote is clever, always finding ways to survive. But the eagle sees everything from above, knows what the coyote cannot see. Together they are stronger than apart." Malcolm looked up, catching her meaning. "You are the coyote," she continued. "Smart, resourceful, but you cannot see all the dangers coming. You need someone who can. And you're the eagle?" A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "My father taught me to read signs, to notice what others miss. The way dust rises differently when horses are walking versus running. How birds go silent before men approach. The smell of gunpowder on the wind." She leaned forward. "Let me help you see what's coming. Let me be more than someone you hide." Malcolm considered this. He had been so focused on protecting her that he hadn't considered what she might contribute beyond labor. But she was right. She had survival skills he lacked, awareness shaped by necessity. "What do you propose?" "We prepare. We make plans for if they come. Hiding places. Escape routes. Signals between us." Her eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "And we watch." "Always watch." Over the next few days, they transformed the ranch into something more strategic. Narlin showed Malcolm how to create a hidden space beneath the floorboards of the barn, large enough for a person to hide, and covered with hay bales that appeared undisturbed. They established a system. If danger approached, Malcolm would hang a red cloth from the porch rail, giving Narlin time to disappear. She taught him Apache words for danger, safety, and wait. They practiced moving silently through the property at night, learning which boards creaked and which paths offered cover. Thunder became part of the early warning system. The stallion's ears and posture could telegraph approaching. Riders long before human senses detected them. But preparation couldn't stop the loneliness of isolation. Malcolm found himself craving trips to town despite the risks, missing human conversation beyond Narlin. And she, he realized, carried her own isolation, cut off from family, culture, language, trapped in a world that saw her as enemy or property rather than person. One night, unable to sleep, Malcolm found her sitting outside, staring at the stars. He joined her on the porch steps, their shoulders nearly touching. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Helping me?" Malcolm thought about his answer carefully. "I regret that helping someone shouldn't be this complicated. But no, I don't regret you being here, even though I have brought danger to your door. You didn't bring it. It followed you. That's different." She turned to look at him, her face half in shadow. "Why do you trust me? You know nothing about me except what I have told you. I could be lying. I could be the killer Hawkins claims. Are you?" "No, but you have no proof of that." Malcolm met her eyes. "I don't need proof." "Thunder trusts you." "That's enough for me." Narlin's expression softened, vulnerability breaking through her careful control. "That horse, he saved my life and brought me to you. Sometimes I think—" She paused, searching for words. "Sometimes I think the spirits have a plan I cannot see yet." "Maybe they do," Malcolm said quietly. Or maybe we're just two people trying to survive in a world that's forgotten how to be kind. They sat in silence, the vastness of the Texas night stretching above them. Somewhere in the darkness, thunder nickered softly, and Nalin smiled at the sound. For a moment the danger felt far away. For a moment there was only the two of them, and the quiet promise of a friendship deepening into something neither could name, but both felt growing. But in Redemption Flats, Lieutenant Hawkins was growing impatient. And patience, once exhausted, gives way to action. The storm was building. They just couldn't see it yet. August burned across the Texas landscape with merciless intensity. The earth cracked beneath the sun's assault, and water became more precious than gold. Malcolm worked harder than ever, maintaining the ranch while keeping Nalin's presence concealed. But the strain was beginning to show in the lines around his eyes and the weight dropping from his frame. Nalin noticed. She watched him return each evening more exhausted than the day before. Watched him skip meals to ensure she had enough. Watched him wake in the night and stare at the ceiling as though calculating costs he couldn't afford to pay. "You are killing yourself," she told him one morning as he prepared to ride out to check the cattle. "This cannot continue." Malcolm cinched the saddle tighter than necessary. "I'm fine. You're not fine. You work from before sun rises until after it sets. You eat half of what you need. You do not sleep." She stepped closer, her voice softening. "I see you, Malcolm. You cannot hide this from me." He turned to face her, and for a moment his careful mask slipped. She saw the exhaustion, yes, but also something deeper, a weariness of spirit that had nothing to do with physical labor. "What choice do I have?" he asked quietly. "If I let the ranch fall apart, we both suffer. If I draw attention by asking for help, they'll find you. So I work. That's all there is to it. There is always choice. You could—" "Don't!" His voice was sharper than he intended. "Don't suggest leaving again. We've been through this." Nalin's jaw tightened, but she nodded. They had indeed been through it several times, each conversation ending in the same stalemate. She wanted to spare him the burden. He refused to let her go. That afternoon, while Malcolm was in the north pasture, a rider appeared on the horizon. Thunder's warning whinny sent Nalin scrambling to the barn, slipping into the hidden space beneath the floorboards. She pulled the trapdoor closed above her and lay in the darkness, her heart hammering, listening to the muffled sounds above. The rider was young Billy Porter, the son of a neighboring rancher who lived 10 miles west. His voice carried through the barn walls as he called out for Malcolm. "Mr. Garrett, you hear? My pa sent me." Nalin heard the boy dismount, his boots scuffing the dirt as he walked around the property. She held her breath, pressing herself flat against the earth, willing him not to investigate the barn too closely. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, she heard the boy remount and ride away, but she remained in her hiding place, counting heartbeats, waiting for Malcolm's signal. When Malcolm returned an hour later and gave the all-clear whistle they'd established, Nalin emerged dusty and shaken. He helped her out, his hands steady on her arms. "Billy Porter came looking for you," she said. He seemed urgent. Malcolm's face darkened with worry. "The Porters are good people. If they sent Billy all this way, something's wrong. You should go to them. I can't leave you alone. Not with riders coming by." "Malcolm." Nalin gripped his arms. "Your neighbors need you. I can hide. I have before. I will again." He struggled with the decision, torn between duty and protection. Finally he nodded. "I'll be back before dark. Stay in the house. Don't go outside for any reason. I understand. Go." Malcolm rode hard toward the Porter ranch, pushing Dancer faster than he should have in the heat. He found William Porter standing in his yard, his face grim. His wife Martha weeping on the porch. "Will, what's happened?" The older man looked up, relief flooding his features. "Malcolm, thank God. It's my son Jacob. He was out riding fence line this morning and his horse came back without him. We've searched for hours but can't find any trace. He's only 14, and with this heat—" Malcolm didn't need to hear more. A boy lost in the August desert had hours at best before dehydration or worse claimed him. "Show me where his horse returned from." They organized quickly. Will, his eldest son Thomas, and Malcolm rode out, while Martha stayed behind in case Jacob found his way home. The trail led northeast into rougher country where arroyos cut deep and rocks created natural mazes. Malcolm's tracking skills, honed by years on the land, picked up signs the others missed: a scuff mark on stone, a disturbed pebble, the faint impression of a boot heel. They followed these breadcrumbs for 3 hours as the sun climbed higher and the heat became dangerous even for experienced riders. There, Thomas pointed to a ravine ahead. "I see something blue." They found Jacob at the bottom of a 15-foot drop, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, his face pale beneath layers of dust. The boy was conscious but delirious, mumbling about seeing his mother. "Easy, son," Malcolm said, climbing down to him. "We've got you. You're going to be fine." Getting Jacob out required rope, patience, and strength Malcolm wasn't sure he had left. But somehow they managed, hauling the boy up while Will waited above to pull him to safety. By the time they had Jacob secured on Thomas's horse and were heading back, the sun was already dipping toward the western horizon. They reached the Porter Ranch as dusk painted the sky purple and gold. Martha burst from the house, her cry of relief sharp enough to scatter the chickens. She clutched Jacob as the men carried him inside, tears streaming down her weathered face. "You saved him," she said to Malcolm, gripping his hand with both of hers. "You saved my boy." "We all did," Malcolm replied, exhausted beyond measure. "No." Will Porter stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "You found him. You knew where to look when we were searching blind. We owe you a debt we can never repay." Malcolm wanted to refuse, to say it was simply what neighbors did for each other. But Will's expression stopped him. This was important, the acknowledgement of a life saved, the weight of gratitude that bonded communities together. "Just take care of that leg," Malcolm said finally. "And keep that boy away from ravines." Will smiled through his worry. "Stay for supper. Martha's already putting something together." You shouldn't ride home in the dark after a day like this. Every instinct screamed at Malcolm to refuse, to get back to Narlin. But to leave now would seem strange, would raise questions he couldn't afford to answer. Just for a short while, he conceded. The meal was simple but hearty: beans, cornbread, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Thomas and his younger siblings chattered about the rescue, their voices bright with excitement now that the danger had passed. Malcolm barely tasted the food, his mind miles away at his own ranch. As full darkness fell, he finally stood to leave. "I appreciate the hospitality, but I need to get back." Of course. Will walked him to Dancer. "Malcolm, I mean what I said. Anything you need, any time, you just ask." "That boy means everything to us." Malcolm nodded, mounted, and rode into the night. The journey home felt endless, each mile weighted with anxiety. The ranch appeared dark and silent as he approached, no lamp burning in the window. His heart seized. Had something happened? Had riders come while he was gone? He dismounted quickly, his hand moving to the rifle on his saddle. "Nolin!" he called softly. "It's me." No answer. Malcolm rushed to the house, threw open the door. "Nolin!" "I am here." Her voice came from the bedroom, calm but strained. He found her sitting on the floor beside the bed, her back against the wall, a knife in her hand. When she saw him, her body sagged with relief, and she let the blade drop. I thought... She couldn't finish. Malcolm understood. Every hour he'd been gone, she had lived in fear that he wouldn't return, that something had happened, that she would be alone again in a hostile world. He crossed the room and knelt beside her. "I'm sorry. I had to stay. The boy was hurt badly. They would have suspected something if I'd left immediately. I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I know you had to. But sitting here in the dark, waiting, not knowing, I've never felt so helpless." Malcolm took her hand, feeling it tremble in his. "I'm here now." "You're safe." "Am I?" She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw the truth they'd both been avoiding. "Am I really safe, Malcolm? Or am I just delaying the inevitable?" He had no answer that wasn't a lie, so he said nothing. Instead, he sat beside her on the floor, their backs against the wall, their hands still joined. Outside, thunder whinnied softly, as if sensing the tension in the house. The sound seemed to break something in Nalin, and she leaned her head against Malcolm's shoulder. "Tell me about her," she said quietly. "Your wife, Sarah." Malcolm tensed, surprised by the question. He rarely spoke of Sarah, found the words too painful to form. But sitting here in the darkness with Nalin, the request felt different. Not an invasion, but an offering, a chance to share the weight he'd been carrying alone. "She was strong," he began slowly. "Not physically, she was small, barely came up to my shoulder. But strong here," he touched his chest. "She could see good in anything. Even when the crops failed or the well ran dry or winter seemed like it would never end, she found something to be grateful for." "How did you meet?" "Church social in Redemption Flats. She was new to town, working as a seamstress. I spilled punch on her dress, and instead of being angry, she laughed. Said it gave her an excuse to try out a new stain removal technique." Malcolm smiled at the memory. "I was hooked right then. She sounds wonderful." She was. "And when the fever took her," his voice caught, "I stopped seeing the good in things, stopped looking for it. This ranch became just work, just survival. Until Thunder brought me," Nalin finished softly. Malcolm nodded. "Until Thunder brought you. And suddenly the house wasn't empty anymore. The silence wasn't so heavy. I had a reason to what? To care again." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to unpack. Nalin lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the rancher who had saved her, but the man who had been saved in return. "I care too," she whispered. Malcolm's breath caught. He knew he should pull away, maintain the careful distance they'd been observing. But he didn't. Instead, he reached up and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. They sat that way, caught in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible, until finally Malcolm stood and helped her to her feet. "You should sleep," he said, his voice rough. "Tomorrow will bring its own troubles." Nalin nodded, but neither of them moved toward their separate sleeping spaces. The air between them hummed with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. Finally, Nalin stepped back. "Good night, Malcolm." "Good night." He returned to his makeshift bed near the hearth, but sleep was impossible. His mind replayed the day, Jacob's rescue, the porter's gratitude, the long ride home through darkness, and Nalin waiting with a knife in her hand. Terrified and alone, they couldn't continue like this, he realized. The isolation was unsustainable. The lies were accumulating. The danger was growing. Something had to change, but what? And at what cost? Outside, the desert night held its secrets close. And in Redemption Flats, Lieutenant Hawkins received a report from an informant that made him smile for the first time in weeks. Malcolm Garrett had been spotted riding toward the Porter Ranch alone, which meant his house had been empty. Empty houses, Hawkins knew, were easier to search than occupied ones. Dawn came with an unnatural stillness. Malcolm woke to silence so complete it felt wrong, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. No birds called. No wind stirred the mesquite. Even Thunder stood motionless in the corral, his ears pricked toward the southern horizon. Malcolm rose quickly, his instincts screaming warning. He moved to the window and scanned the landscape, seeing nothing but empty land, stretching in all directions. Yet the wrongness persisted, crawling along his spine like spider legs. "Something comes," Nalin said from behind him. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom, already dressed, her hair braided back for quick movement. "The land is too quiet." Malcolm grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch. The sun hung low and red, painting the world in shades of blood and copper. Then he saw it, dust rising in the distance, not the gentle plume of a single rider, but the thick cloud of many horses moving fast. "Go," he told Nalin urgently. Now the barn, she didn't argue, didn't hesitate. She was across the yard and disappearing into the barn within seconds. Malcolm watched her vanish into the hiding space they'd prepared, then turned to face what was coming. The riders emerged from the dust, like phantoms solidifying. Lieutenant Hawkins led them, his uniform crisp despite the early hour, his face set with grim determination. Behind him rode Deputy Mills and 4 cavalry soldiers, all armed, all watching Malcolm with predatory focus. They pulled up at the fence line, forming a semicircle that blocked any escape route. Hawkins dismounted with deliberate slowness, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Garrett," he touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. "Apologies for the early visit. We need to search your property." Malcolm's grip tightened on his rifle, though he kept it pointed at the ground. "On what grounds?" "Information received suggests you're harboring a fugitive, specifically the Apache woman we discussed previously." Hawkins pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "I have authorization from the territorial governor. You can read it if you like, or you can step aside and let us do our job." Malcolm's mind raced. The hiding spot was good, but would it withstand a thorough military search? And even if Nalin remained hidden, what would they do when they found the extra supplies, the women's clothing he'd purchased, the evidence of a second person living here? "I told you before," Malcolm said evenly. "I haven't seen any Apache, and I told you that lying to a federal officer carries consequences." Hawkins stepped forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Last chance, Garrett. Where is she?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Hawkins's eyes hardened. "Search everything. The house, the barn, the sheds. Tear it apart if you have to." The soldiers moved with military efficiency, spreading across the property. Malcolm's heart hammered as 2 of them headed straight for the barn. He forced himself to remain still, to show no reaction that might give anything away. Deputy Mills entered the house, and Malcolm heard him moving through rooms, opening cabinets, checking under furniture. Another soldier searched the chicken coop, scattering the hens in a flurry of squawking and feathers. In the barn, the soldiers were methodical. Malcolm listened to the sound of hay bales being moved, equipment being shifted, the creak of ladder rungs as someone climbed to the loft. His palms were slick with sweat. Minutes passed like hours. Hawkins stood watching Malcolm's face, searching for any tell, any flicker of nervousness that would confirm his suspicions. "Found something." Mills called from the house. Malcolm's stomach dropped. Hawkins strode toward the door, and Malcolm followed, his mind already spinning excuses, explanations. Anything that might protect Nalin. Mills held up a dress, one of the simple cotton ones Malcolm had purchased for Nalin in a town 30 miles away to avoid local suspicion. "This was in the bedroom." "Seems mighty small for you, Garrett." "It was my wife's," Malcolm said quickly. "I kept some of her things." "Your wife's been dead 3 years," Hawkins said. "Yet this dress smells freshly worn. Still has desert dust on the hem." The trap was closing. Malcolm could feel it tightening around him like a noose. He said nothing, knowing that any answer he gave would only make things worse. Hawkins' smile was cold. "You're finished, Garrett. When we find her, and we will find her, you'll hang alongside her for treason and harboring a fugitive. Your only chance is to tell us now where she's hiding. Cooperate, and maybe the judge shows leniency." Malcolm met his eyes with steel resolve. "I have nothing to tell you." "Then you're a fool." Hawkins turned to his men. "Keep searching. She's here somewhere." The soldiers returned to their work with renewed intensity. In the barn, one of them began stabbing his bayonet into hay bales, probing for hollow spaces. Malcolm's breath caught as the soldier moved closer to the hiding spot. Then Thunder screamed. The sound was primal, furious, unlike anything Malcolm had ever heard from the stallion. Thunder reared in the corral, his hooves striking the air, his eyes rolling white. The soldier in the barn turned toward the commotion, momentarily distracted. "Control that damn horse!" Hawkins shouted, but Thunder was beyond control. He charged the corral fence, crashed against it with his full weight. The post shuddered but held. The stallion wheeled and charged again, his rage palpable, drawing every eye toward him. Malcolm understood. The horse was creating a distraction, giving Nalin precious seconds. "Lieutenant," one of the soldiers called from behind the house. "Tracks here, fresh, leading toward the creek." Hawkins spun. "Show me." The men converged on the back of the property, following tracks Malcolm knew couldn't be Nalin's. She hadn't left the barn. But the soldiers didn't know that. They saw what they expected to see, evidence of someone fleeing. She ran when she heard us coming, Hawkins said, excitement coloring his voice. Mills, you and Johnson stay here and finish searching. The rest of you with me. She can't have gotten far on foot. 4 riders thundered away from the ranch, following the false trail toward the creek. Malcolm watched them go, his heart still pounding. Deputy Mills and the remaining soldier, Johnson, continued their search with less enthusiasm, clearly disappointed to miss the chase. They spent another 30 minutes checking and rechecking, but without their lieutenant's driving intensity. Finally, Mills wiped sweat from his forehead. I don't think she's here, Johnson. Those tracks were fresh. She probably heard us coming from a mile away and ran. What about the dress? Could be his wife's, like he said. Or maybe she was here earlier and moved on. Either way, Hawkins will catch her at the creek. Let's go. They mounted and rode south, leaving Malcolm alone in the wreckage of his home. Furniture overturned, belongings scattered, supplies dumped across the floor. He waited until the dust of their departure settled before moving. "Nalin," he called softly. "They're gone." No response. Malcolm's chest tightened with sudden fear. He ran to the barn, threw aside the hay bales, and yanked open the hidden door. The space was empty. "Nalin!" He climbed down, searching the darkness with frantic hands. Nothing. He emerged from the barn, spinning in place, scanning every direction. "Nalin!" "Here," her voice came from above. Malcolm looked up. She was in the cottonwood near the creek, perched on a high branch, her body pressed against the trunk. Even knowing she was there, he could barely see her. She blended with the bark and leaves like she'd been born from the tree itself. "How did you—" When I heard Thunder scream, I knew he was buying time. I ran. She began climbing down with the grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in trees. I laid a false trail toward the creek, then doubled back and climbed. Old Apache trick. Soldiers always follow the obvious path. She dropped the last few feet and landed beside him, breathing hard. The tracks will lead them in circles until they give up. But Malcolm, her face was grave. They found the dress. They know. They suspect. They don't know for certain. Suspicion is enough. They will come back with more men, with dogs next time. We cannot— She stopped, her eyes widening. Thunder. Where is Thunder? They turned toward the corral. It stood empty, the gate hanging open where the stallion's charge had broken the latch. Hoofprints led northeast, into the open desert. Malcolm felt something crack inside his chest. The horse had saved them again, and now he was gone, running into the same wilderness where he'd found Nalin. He will come back, Nalin said softly, touching Malcolm's arm. He always comes back. Maybe. Malcolm's voice was hollow. Or maybe he's done what he needed to do, and now he's free. They stood in silence, staring at the empty corral. The sun climbed higher, and the day's heat began building. Around them the ranch lay in disarray, violated, searched, no longer safe. We can't stay here, Malcolm said finally. Where will we go? He turned to face her, and in that moment everything clarified. The ranch was just land and buildings. What mattered was standing beside him, waiting for his answer with trust in her eyes, despite everything he'd failed to protect her from. North, he said, to find your father. To take you home. Nalin's eyes widened. Malcolm, you cannot. If you take me to my people, you become an enemy of the army. They will hunt you forever. You will lose everything. I already lost everything 3 years ago when Sarah died. This, he gestured at the ranch, it's just wood and dirt. You're alive. You're real. And you deserve to be free. And you? She asked softly. What do you deserve? Malcolm looked at her. This woman who'd come into his life carried by a mysterious black stallion, who'd taught him to see abundance in emptiness, who'd reminded him what it meant to care about something beyond mere survival. Maybe I deserve a second chance, he said, to do something that matters, to choose what's right over what's safe. Nalin stepped closer, her hand finding his. Then we go together, Malcolm nodded. They had perhaps a few hours before Hawkins realized he'd been chasing shadows and returned. They needed to pack light, move fast, and disappear into country where cavalry horses couldn't follow, as they prepared to abandon the only home Malcolm had known as a man. He looked one last time at the empty corral. Thunder was out there somewhere, running free under the same sky that had witnessed everything. "Thank you," Malcolm whispered to the absent horse, "for bringing her to me, for giving us a chance." The wind carried his words away into the desert, where secrets went to live forever, and in the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came the sound of a horse's whinny, wild, free, and somehow joyful. They left within the hour, taking only what could be carried on Dancer's back. Malcolm packed dried meat, hardtack, 2 canteens of water, ammunition, and a bedroll. Nalin gathered herbs, a fire-starting kit, and the knife she'd carried since her escape. Everything else, the furniture Sarah had loved, the tools Malcolm had collected over years, the small comforts that made a house a home, they left behind. Malcolm took one last look at the ranch from the saddle. The adobe walls stood solid against the morning sun, indifferent to being abandoned. He'd built those walls with his own hands, mixed every batch of mud, laid every brick. Now he was riding away, possibly forever, and the weight of that choice pressed against his ribs like a stone. Nalin sat behind him on Dancer, her arms wrapped around his waist. She said nothing, but he felt her cheek rest briefly against his shoulder blade, a gesture of comfort, of shared loss, of gratitude she couldn't put into words. "North," Malcolm said, nudging Dancer forward. "You'll need to guide us once we're past the settlements." "I will." "But Malcolm," she hesitated, "my people may not welcome you. A white man arriving with me after what has happened. They may see you as enemy, not friend. Then you'll have to convince them otherwise. And if I cannot?" Malcolm didn't answer. They both knew the risks. Apache justice could be swift and brutal, especially toward those they considered invaders. But staying meant certain death or imprisonment for Nalin, and Malcolm had made his choice. Whatever waited in the northern mountains, they would face it together. They rode through country Malcolm knew well at first. Past the Porter Ranch where smoke rose from the morning fire, past the dried creek bed where he'd once hunted antelope, past the ridge where he'd proposed to Sarah under a sky full of stars. Each landmark was a memory, a piece of his life being left behind with every mile. By midday they'd reached territory unfamiliar to him. The land rose gradually, the flat desert giving way to rocky outcroppings and scattered juniper trees. Nalin directed him away from the main trails, guiding them along paths only someone raised in this country would recognize. Game trails, dry washes, routes that left minimal tracks. "We must move like water," she explained during a brief rest. "Water finds the path of least resistance, flows around obstacles, leaves little trace. This is how my people have survived." Malcolm studied the landscape with new eyes, seeing not emptiness, but a complex terrain full of hiding places and natural cover. Nalin pointed out edible plants, water sources hidden in rock formations, signs of animal movement that indicated safe passage. "You're teaching me to see like an Apache," he observed. "I am teaching you to survive." Out here, there is no difference. They traveled through the afternoon, stopping frequently to rest Dancer and check their back trail. No dust rose behind them, but both knew Hawkins wouldn't give up easily. The lieutenant had resources, determination, and the full weight of military authority. He would follow. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, Nalin guided them into a narrow canyon. High walls of red stone rose on either side, and at the canyon's end, a small spring bubbled from the rock face into a crystal-clear pool. "We camp here," she said. "The walls hide our fire, and there is only one way in. We can defend this place if needed." Malcolm dismounted and helped Nalin down. They worked in comfortable silence, establishing camp with the efficiency of 2 people learning each other's rhythms. Malcolm tended to Dancer while Nalin gathered deadfall for a fire. Within 30 minutes, they had a small blaze going and coffee brewing in a battered tin pot. The temperature dropped quickly as darkness fell. Desert nights could be cruel, stealing the day's warmth within hours. They sat close to the fire, sharing the single bedroll as a backrest, and ate dried meat washed down with bitter coffee. "How far to your people?" Malcolm asked. 4 days, maybe 5. "The mountains are—" She paused, searching for the word. "Complicated. Many canyons, many paths, easy to get lost, easy to hide. That's why the army hasn't found them. That, and we have watchers." Scouts who see soldiers coming from miles away. They will see us too. She looked at him, her face serious in the firelight. When they do, you must let me speak first. Do not reach for your gun. Do not make sudden movements. Show respect. I understand. Do you? Her voice held an edge. Malcolm, you have been kind to me. You have risked everything. But my people have seen kindness from white men before, and it always came with a hidden cost. Treaties signed and broken. Promises made and forgotten. Children taken to schools that erase their spirits. Malcolm heard the pain beneath her words, the accumulated betrayals of generations. What can I do to prove I'm different? Nothing. They must decide for themselves. She shifted closer to the fire, hugging her knees. My father is a good man, but he is also a chief. He must think of all our people, not just his daughter. If he believes you are a threat, or that keeping you brings danger, he'll kill me. Nalin didn't deny it. He will do what protects the tribe, always. They sat in silence, watching sparks rise into the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang its lonesome song, and another answered from a different ridge. The sound was haunting and beautiful, a reminder that they were not alone in this vast wilderness. Tell me about him, Malcolm said. Your father. Help me understand who I'm riding toward. Nalin's expression softened. He is strong like a mountain. When he speaks, people listen because his words carry wisdom earned through suffering. He fought in many battles when he was young, earned his war name through courage. But he is also, she smiled faintly, he is gentle with children. He makes them laugh. And he loved my mother so much that when she died, part of him died too. Malcolm felt a kinship with this man he'd never met. How did she die? Smallpox, brought by traders. It swept through our camp like fire, took many. My mother, my youngest brother, my grandmother. My father held her as she died, and when it was over, he walked into the desert for 3 days. When he returned, he was changed, harder, more determined that our people would not lose anything else. That's why he won't go to the reservation. That, and because the reservation is slow death. No hunting, no freedom, just waiting for food that often doesn't come. Better to die fighting, he says, than to die with empty bellies on land that was stolen from us. Malcolm understood the impossible choice. Surrender meant starvation and cultural erasure. Resistance meant war against an enemy with infinite resources. There were no good options, only degrees of suffering. What do you believe? He asked. About fighting versus surrendering. Nalin was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. I believe the world is changing whether we want it to or not. I believe fighting can be brave and also futile. I believe, she turned to him, I believe that sometimes survival means adapting, and that adaptation is not the same as surrender. Your father might disagree. He does disagree. We argued many times before I was taken. He called me weak for considering compromise. I called him stubborn for refusing to see what was coming. Her voice cracked slightly. Our last words were in anger. And then the soldiers came, and I never had a chance to tell him I understood his heart, even if I disagreed with his methods. Malcolm reached out and took her hand. You'll get that chance. We'll make sure of it. She squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from the contact. I hope so. I hope I can help him see that there might be another way. That not all white men are enemies. That friendship is possible even between people who have been taught to hate each other. Is that what we are? Malcolm asked softly. Friends? Nalin looked at him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. We are more than that. We are two people who chose each other when the world said we should not. We are proof that walls built by fear can be crossed by courage. The air between them charged with electricity. Malcolm felt it pulling at him, drawing him closer. Nalin didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and fierce all at once, a declaration, a promise, a recognition of something that had been building since the moment thunder had brought them together. When they pulled apart, both were breathless. Nalin rested her forehead against his, her hand on his chest where his heart hammered. This complicates everything, she whispered. No, my father will not approve, probably. Not. Your people will shun. You dare let them? She laughed softly, sadly. You are a fool, Malcolm Garrett. Maybe. But I'm your fool. They held each other as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead. Dancer stood nearby, her presence comforting. The canyon walls sheltered them from the wind, but not from the knowledge of what lay ahead. Tomorrow they would ride deeper into Apache territory. Tomorrow they would face judgment from people who had every reason to distrust them. Tomorrow might bring acceptance or death, sanctuary or war, but tonight in this small pocket of stone and starlight they had each other. And for now that was enough. Malcolm woke once in the darkness, Nalin sleeping against his shoulder. He listened to the night sounds. Wind through rock, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft breathing of the woman beside him. He thought about his ranch, standing empty under the same stars, about thunder running free somewhere in the wilderness, about the strange path that had led him from grief-stricken widower to fugitive harboring the woman he loved. Love. The word startled him, but he didn't shy from it. Somehow, impossibly, he'd fallen in love with Nalin, and that love would either save them both or destroy them. He closed his eyes and pulled her closer, feeling her settle against him in sleep. Whatever came with the dawn, they would face it as they'd faced everything else, together. The canyon held them safe through the night, and the stars kept watch as two people from different worlds dreamed of a future where difference didn't mean division, where walls could be bridges, and where love could triumph over hate. But the mountains ahead held secrets of their own, and in 4 days, those secrets would be revealed. The mountains rose before them like ancient guardians, their peaks touching clouds that seemed close enough to grasp. Malcolm had never seen country like this, rugged, vertical, alive with hidden dangers and breathtaking beauty in equal measure. Pine trees clung to impossible slopes, and eagles soared on thermals that rose from sun-heated stone. They had been climbing for 3 days, following paths that weren't really paths, navigating terrain that would kill anyone unfamiliar with its secrets. Twice they'd had to backtrack when rockslides blocked their way. Once they'd waited hours while a mountain lion prowled nearby, unwilling to challenge the apex predator for passage. Nalin moved through this landscape with confidence born of childhood memory. She found water where Malcolm saw only dry rock, identified safe routes across scree fields that looked identical to his untrained eye, and read the land like some men read books. On the afternoon of the 4th day, everything changed. One moment they were alone in the wilderness, the next they were surrounded. Warriors appeared from behind boulders, from tree cover, from places Malcolm would have sworn were empty seconds before. There were 6 of them, all young men armed with rifles and traditional weapons, their faces painted for war, their eyes hard with suspicion. Malcolm's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, but Nalin's grip on his arm stopped him. "Don't," she hissed. "Let me speak." She slid from Dancer and stepped forward, her hands visible and empty. She spoke in rapid Apache, her voice carrying both authority and respect. The warriors responded, their initial aggression softening slightly as they recognized her. But their weapons remained trained on Malcolm. The conversation continued for several minutes. Malcolm caught his name spoken once, then again. He saw doubt flicker across the warriors' faces, saw them exchange glances, weighted with meaning he couldn't interpret. Finally, the eldest of them, a man perhaps 25, with a scar running from temple to jaw, stepped forward. He spoke to Nalin, then gestured at Malcolm with his rifle. She nodded, turned to Malcolm, and said in English, "They will take us to my father, but you must give them your weapons." All of them. Malcolm's stomach clenched. Surrendering his arms meant complete vulnerability. If the tribe decided he was an enemy, he'd have no way to defend himself or Nalin. "Malcolm," Nalin said softly, reading his hesitation. "Please trust me." He looked into her eyes and found his answer. Slowly, he removed his rifle from the saddle, his revolver from his hip, and the knife from his boot. He handed them to the scarred warrior, who accepted them without expression. The warriors closed in, forming an escort that was more guard detail than honor procession. They moved through the mountains with impressive speed, following routes that seemed to appear and disappear like magic. Malcolm concentrated on not falling from Dancer as the terrain grew steeper and the paths narrower. 2 hours later, they crested a ridge and Malcolm's breath caught. Below, nestled in a hidden valley ringed by protective peaks, was the Apache camp. Wickups, traditional dome-shaped dwellings, dotted the valley floor, their frames covered with brush and hides. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played near a stream that cut through the valley's center. Women worked at various tasks, their voices carrying on the wind. It was a living community, not the desperate refugees Malcolm had imagined. But as they descended, activity stopped. People emerged from wiki-ups, set down their work, turned to watch. Malcolm felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, measuring, judging, calculating threat. An older man walked toward them with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He was perhaps 50, his hair streaked with grey, but his body still strong. His face was weathered like stone carved by wind, and his eyes, the same dark honey color as Nalin's, held both wisdom and wariness. Nalin slid from the horse and ran to him. "Father!" He caught her in his arms, and for a moment the hardness left his face, replaced by naked relief and love. He held his daughter, murmuring words Malcolm couldn't understand, his hand cradling the back of her head as though she were still a child. But when he pulled back and saw Malcolm, the softness vanished. He spoke sharply to Nalin in Apache. She responded, gesturing to Malcolm, her voice earnest. Her father's expression darkened with each word. Around them the crowd pressed closer, their murmurs growing louder. The chief, Goyakla, Malcolm reminded himself, turned and spoke to the assembled people. His voice carried the authority of generations, each word heavy with meaning. When he finished, several warriors stepped forward and grabbed Malcolm, pulling him roughly from Dancer. "Wait!" Malcolm struggled, but there were too many hands. "Nalin! Do not fight them!" she called out, her voice desperate. "Please, Malcolm, do not fight." They dragged him across the camp to a wiki-up set, apart from the others. Inside, they bound his hands behind his back with rawhide strips that bit into his wrists. Then they left him there, alone in the dim interior, with only a single guard posted outside. Hours passed. Malcolm's mind raced through scenarios, each worse than the last. He could hear voices outside, angry debates, accusations, defenses. He recognized Nalin's voice rising above others, pleading, arguing. But he couldn't understand the words. The sun was setting when the entrance flap opened and an elderly woman entered. She carried a bowl of water and a piece of flatbread. Her face was deeply lined, her hair white as snow, but her eyes were sharp and assessing. She studied Malcolm in silence, then set the food and water within his reach. His bound hands made eating awkward, but she didn't offer to free him. Instead, she spoke in surprisingly clear English. "You are the one who protected Nalin." Malcolm nearly choked on the bread. "You speak English?" "I lived 20 years in the white man's world. Married a soldier, bore his children. Then his people sent me away when he died, said I had no place among them." Her smile was bitter. "So yes, I speak your language. It is useful to know the enemy's tongue. I'm not your enemy. That remains to be seen." "You are white. White men have taken our land, killed our children, broken every promise they ever made. Why should we believe you are different?" "Because I gave up everything to bring Nalin home. My ranch, my livelihood, my safety. I chose her over all of it." The old woman's eyes narrowed. "Or you are a spy, sent to find our camp and report its location to the soldiers." Malcolm hadn't considered that possibility. But he saw immediately how it would look to people who'd learned suspicion through painful experience. "If I were a spy, I'd have marked the trail here. I'd have left signs for others to follow. I didn't. Perhaps you are simply waiting for the right moment. Then why warn you? Why tell you my suspicion at all?" She smiled faintly, and Malcolm realized she'd been testing him. "Nalin speaks for you. She says you are honorable, that you risked your life for her many times. She says..." The old woman paused. "She says she loves you." Malcolm's heart clenched. "I love her too. Love is not enough. Love does not stop bullets." Love does not feed children when the buffalo are gone and the army surrounds us. She leaned closer. Goyakla will decide your fate tomorrow. There will be a council. You will speak and the elders will judge. If they believe you, you may live. If not, she didn't finish, but Malcolm understood. His life hung by the thinnest of threads, dependent on his ability to convince people who had every reason not to trust him. What should I say? The truth. Only the truth. We have heard enough lies from white men to recognize them instantly. She rose to leave, then paused at the entrance. Nalin has suffered much. She deserves happiness. I hope you are worthy of her. For both your sakes, she left. And Malcolm was alone again, with his thoughts and his bound hands, and the knowledge that tomorrow he would face judgment from people whose suffering he could acknowledge, but never truly understand. Night fell. Through the Wiki-Up's walls, Malcolm heard the sounds of camp life, children being called to dinner, dogs barking, the low murmur of conversation. Normal sounds, domestic sounds, reminding him that these were not savages or enemies, but simply people trying to survive in an impossible situation. He thought about his ranch, now surely occupied by Lieutenant Hawkins or claimed by the territorial government. He thought about Thunder, running free in the wilderness. He thought about Sarah, and wondered what she would say about the choices he'd made, but mostly he thought about Nalin, somewhere in this camp, probably arguing with her father, fighting for a future that seemed more impossible with each passing hour. Malcolm had faced death before, blizzards, rattlesnakes, men with grievances and guns, but he'd never faced judgment quite like this. Tomorrow he would stand before people he'd wronged simply by existing in a world that had wronged them, and he would have to convince them that he was more than the sum of his skin color. The task seemed impossible. But then, so had everything else, since the day his horse came home carrying an Apache woman on its back. He closed his eyes and prayed, not to any specific god, but to whatever force had brought him and Nalin together, that tomorrow would bring wisdom rather than vengeance, understanding rather than retribution. Outside, the camp settled into sleep. Guards walked the perimeter, watching for threats, both animal and human. Somewhere in the darkness, Nalin lay awake, her own prayers rising into the night sky, and in the Wiki-Up, where the elders gathered, Goyakla stared into the fire and wrestled with an impossible question. How do you trust a white man when every white man who came before him proved unworthy of trust? The answer would come with dawn, and dawn was already approaching, inevitable as judgment itself. Dawn broke over the mountains with a clarity that made every detail sharp, the way frost clung to grass blades like tiny diamonds, the smoke rising from morning fires in perfect vertical columns, the faces of warriors who came to collect Malcolm from the Wiki-Up. They cut his bonds with quick, efficient movements, allowing blood to flow painfully back into his hands. Malcolm flexed his fingers, feeling pins and needles shoot through his palms, but their rifles remained trained on him as they gestured for him to stand. The walk to the center of camp felt like a journey to the gallows. Every step was measured, deliberate, final. Malcolm's legs trembled slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what was about to happen. His entire future and Nalin's happiness would be decided in the next hour by people who had every reason to condemn him. A large circle had been formed in the camp's central clearing, ringed by the entire tribe. Malcolm estimated over 100 people gathered, maybe more. Elders sat on one side on woven mats, their faces weathered maps of survival and loss, each line telling stories of battles fought, children lost, treaties broken. Warriors stood behind them in silent ranks, weapons ready, their eyes tracking Malcolm's every movement with the focus of men trained to detect threat. Women and children filled the remaining spaces, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. At the circle's head sat Goyakla, elevated slightly on a natural stone formation that served as his seat of judgment. His presence commanded the space despite his stillness, like a mountain that didn't need to move to prove its power. Nalin stood to her father's right, her face pale but determined. She wore traditional dress, deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the morning light, and her hair was braided in the style of unmarried Apache women. When Malcolm's eyes found hers across the circle, she gave him the smallest nod. Courage, support, love conveyed in that single gesture. He drew strength from it, straightening his spine, lifting his chin. The warriors positioned Malcolm in the circle's center, exposed and vulnerable from all angles. He stood straight, despite his exhaustion, despite the fear coiling in his belly, meeting the eyes of those who judged him without flinching. He would not cower, even facing death. Sarah had taught him that dignity mattered, especially in the hardest moments. He would honor that lesson now. Goyakla rose, and silence fell like a physical weight, pressing down on the assembled crowd. He wore the regalia of his position, a war shirt decorated with symbols Malcolm didn't understand, a necklace of bear claws, face paint applied with ceremonial precision. He spoke in Apache, his voice carrying to every person present, resonating with authority earned through decades of leadership. Malcolm couldn't understand the words, but he heard their power, their authority, their pain. This was a man who'd watched his world crumble piece by piece and fought with everything he had to preserve what remained for his people. The speech lasted several minutes, Goyakla's voice rising and falling with emotion, sometimes sharp with anger, sometimes heavy with sorrow. Malcolm watched Naylin's face as her father spoke, saw her eyes glisten with unshed tears, saw her jaw clench with what might have been agreement or disagreement. He couldn't tell. When Goyakla finished, the elderly woman from the previous night, Desba, Malcolm had learned her name, stepped forward to translate. She moved with the careful dignity of advanced age, her white hair gleaming in the sunlight. "The chief says you stand accused of being a spy, of leading soldiers to our home, of using his daughter for your own purposes," Desba began, her English crisp and clear despite her years. "He says white men speak with forked tongues, that their promises are like morning mist, visible but without substance, gone when the sun rises. He asks why you should be believed when so many others have proven false. He asks what makes you different from the treaty makers who smiled while lying, from the generals who promised peace while sharpening their swords." The accusations hung in the air like smoke. Malcolm took a breath, steadying himself against the weight of history he was being asked to answer for. "May I speak?" Desba translated. Goyakla regarded him for a long moment before nodding once, a gesture that granted permission but promised nothing. "I came here for one reason only," Malcolm began, his voice clear and strong, projecting to the edges of the circle. "To bring Nalin home safely. That's all. I'm not a spy. I'm not working for the army. I haven't been sent by anyone or paid by anyone. I'm just a rancher who found a woman dying in the desert and couldn't turn away." As Desba translated, Malcolm watched the faces around him. Some remained hostile, jaw muscles tight, eyes narrowed. Others showed curiosity, heads tilting slightly, expressions shifting from predetermined judgment to actual listening. Most revealed nothing, faces as impassive as the mountains themselves. "I know you have no reason to trust me," he continued, forcing himself to speak slowly so Desba could translate accurately. "Your people have been lied to, betrayed, hunted like animals by men who looked like me. I can't undo that. I can't speak for other white men or make their wrongs right. I can only tell you what I've done and why I did it." He spoke of finding Nalin, unconscious and dehydrated, with thunder standing guard over her body like a sentinel. He described the nights of fever, spooning water into her mouth, wondering if she would survive until morning. He told them about Lieutenant Hawkins' searches, the dress discovered, the threat of imprisonment or worse. He described the town's suspicion, the whispers that followed Nalin whenever she appeared in public. The way even good people turned their faces away from what they didn't want to see. "I could have turned her over," Malcolm said, and his voice roughened with emotion. "I could have collected the reward money, $50 that would have bought supplies for a year. I could have protected myself by betraying her. Every practical reason told me to do exactly that." He paused, letting Desba catch up with the translation. "But I didn't. I gave up everything I had instead. My home, which I built with my own hands over 2 summers of bleeding palms and aching back. My livelihood, 500 acres of land that I'd worked for 15 years. My place in the only community I've ever known, among people I grew up with, people who knew my parents and grandparents. Malcolm's voice cracked slightly, the loss hitting him fresh. I abandoned all of it, left it standing empty for the territorial government to claim or Lieutenant Hawkins to occupy. I did it because he looked directly at Nalin, his eyes locked with hers. Because keeping Nalin safe mattered more than keeping my property. I did it because I love her. And love doesn't calculate cost or count sacrifice. It just acts. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Some sounded skeptical, others surprised. Desba translated, and Malcolm saw Goyakla's expression shift, not softening exactly, but considering, weighing, the set of his jaw loosening slightly. One of the elders, a man so old his face seemed carved from ancient wood, his eyes milky with age but still sharp with intelligence, spoke. His voice was thin but carried authority. Desba translated, "Love is easy to claim. Pretty words cost nothing. How do we know your love is real and not manipulation? White men have used love as a weapon before, to divide our people, to steal our daughters, and make them ashamed of who they are." The accusation stung because Malcolm understood its truth. He'd heard stories of Indian boarding schools, of forced assimilation, of love used as a tool for cultural destruction. "You can't know from my words alone," Malcolm admitted honestly. "Words are cheap. I could stand here all day speaking of love and honor and prove nothing. But look at Nalin, ask her. She knows whether I've treated her with honor or exploited her vulnerability. She knows whether my actions matched my words during the months she lived under my roof. She knows if I ever demanded anything from her, ever used her desperation against her, ever made her feel she owed me something beyond basic human decency." Goyakla spoke directly to his daughter, his voice gentler now, but still carrying the weight of paternal authority. Nalin stepped forward, moving to the center of the circle beside Malcolm. She stood tall, her shoulders back, and addressed the council in Apache. She spoke for several minutes, her hands gesturing expressively, her voice growing passionate as she continued. Malcolm heard his name multiple times, heard the Apache words for kindness and protection and honor that Desba had taught him the previous night. He saw Nalin's face animate with emotion, gratitude, defiance, love, determination, all flickering across her features like firelight. She pointed at her father at one moment, her voice rising, and Malcolm recognized the tone of someone arguing against unjust judgment. Then she turned and gestured to Malcolm, her voice softening, filling with warmth that needed no translation. When she finished, tears streaked her cheeks, but she stood tall, meeting her father's eyes without wavering, without apology for her feelings or her choices. Goyakla's face remained stone, unreadable as granite. He let the silence stretch for a long moment before speaking again. Desba translated, her voice carrying both the chief's words and their emotional weight. "My daughter says you showed her kindness when you owed her nothing, that you protected her when you could have earned reward by betraying her to those who hunted her, that you gave her food from your own mouth when supplies were low, that you gave her your bed while you slept on the floor, that you taught her to trust again after men broke that trust through violence and cruelty." Malcolm's jaw tightened at the reminder of what Nalin had suffered before Thunder found her. "She also says," Desba continued, each word carefully enunciated, "that you never demanded anything from her, never used her vulnerability as leverage, never made her feel she had to repay your kindness with her body or her submission, that you are honorable in ways that shame those who claim civilization while practicing barbarism." Another elder spoke, a woman this time, her hair silver as moonlight, her eyes sharp as obsidian despite her age. She wore the marks of a medicine woman, strings of turquoise and shells around her neck. Desba translated, "But honor in one man does not erase the dishonor of thousands. My granddaughter was taken to a white man's school, told her language was savage, beaten for speaking the words her mother taught her. She came back to us empty, broken, no longer knowing who she was. If we accept you, do we invite more? Do we open a door that brings soldiers behind it? Do we teach our children that white men can be trusted after all, only to have that lesson kill them? The question cut to the heart of the dilemma. Malcolm felt its weight, understood the impossible position these people were in. Damned if they trusted, damned if they didn't. "No," Malcolm said firmly, his voice ringing across the circle. "I haven't told anyone where you are. When we traveled here, I covered our tracks carefully, backtracked twice, crossed streams to break the trail. I memorized the route but would die before revealing it. And I never will reveal this place, not to save my own life, not under torture, not for any reason. That's not a casual promise or empty words. It's an oath I'll keep until death, and beyond if spirits can be held to promises. Death may come sooner than you think," a young warrior called out in broken English, stepping forward from the ranks. He was perhaps 25, his face painted for war, a rifle cradled in his arms. "Your soldiers hunt us like animals. Your people want our land, want us dead or penned like cattle. Why should we keep Snake in our home? Why not kill you now and be certain you tell no one?" The crowd murmured agreement with this more pragmatic approach. Malcolm turned to face the speaker directly, meeting his hostility without aggression. "Because I'm not a snake," Malcolm said evenly. "I'm just a man who made a choice. Keep me or cast me out, accept me or reject me, but judge me by my actions, not by the actions of others who share my skin color. I didn't make your treaties and then break them. I didn't order the massacres or the relocations. I'm not responsible for every crime every white man ever committed, any more than you're responsible for every raid every Apache warrior ever made." The young warrior's eyes flashed with anger, but an older warrior put a hand on his shoulder, speaking quietly in Apache. The young man subsided, though his expression remained hostile. Goyakla stood again, and Malcolm turned to face him. The chief descended from his stone seat and walked forward, entering the circle until he stood only a few feet from Malcolm. Up close, Malcolm could see the scars that marked the chief's arms and chest, evidence of battles fought. Hardships endured, a life lived on the edge of survival. The chief spoke, his voice heavy with authority and sorrow that seemed to age him before Malcolm's eyes. Desba translated with equal weight. 3 winters ago, soldiers came with white flags and promises of peace. They said they wanted to negotiate, to find a way for our peoples to live without war. They asked to meet with our elders under truce. My brother went, trusting their words, because he believed that some white men might be different, might be honorable. They killed him under that flag of truce, shot him in the back as he walked away, and left his body in the dirt for the buzzards. His wife became my wife. His children became my children. Since then, I have not trusted white men's words. Words are wind. Only actions matter. Malcolm felt the weight of that betrayal, understood the wound that wouldn't heal, the brother's ghost that haunted every decision Goyakla made. "I can't defend what they did," Malcolm said quietly. "It was dishonorable and cruel, a violation of everything that makes us human. But I'm not them, and punishing me for their crimes doesn't bring justice. It doesn't bring your brother back. It just continues the cycle of pain, ensures that the wounds never heal, that trust becomes impossible for everyone." Silence fell, thick and heavy as wool. Goyakla stared at Malcolm, and Malcolm held his gaze, letting the chief see into him, all his flaws and failures, his grief over Sarah, his genuine love for Nalin, his desperate hope that bridges could be built across chasms of history and hatred. The moment stretched until Malcolm's lungs burned from holding his breath. Then Goyakla spoke again, and Desba translated slowly, carefully, giving weight to each word. "My daughter believes you are different from other white men. She risks her reputation and her place among us by defending you so passionately. If I accept you, I accept her judgment. Tell her that I trust her wisdom. If I reject you, I reject her choice. Tell her that she cannot decide her own fate, that her father knows better than she does what her heart needs." He paused, and the entire camp held its breath, every eye locked on the chief. "But I am not just a father. I am chief. I must think not only of one daughter but of all my people, the children who depend on my decisions, the elders who trust my wisdom, the warriors who follow my leadership. Their safety comes before my heart. It must. Malcolm's stomach dropped. This was rejection, dressed in careful words, but rejection nonetheless. Then Goyakla continued, and Desba's translation carried unexpected hope. Therefore, you will prove yourself through action, not words. You will live among us for one full cycle of seasons, from this moon to the next summer's moon. You will work alongside our men, hunt with them, fight beside them if enemies come. You will learn our language, our customs, our ways of seeing the world. You will show through every day's actions whether your words have substance or are merely wind. If after 1 year we judge you worthy, if the council agrees you have earned your place, you may stay. You may marry my daughter if she still wishes it, become one of us in truth. But if we judge you false, if you prove to be a spy or bring danger to us, you will leave and never return. And if you refuse to leave, Goyakla's hand moved to the knife at his belt, then you will not leave at all. Do you accept these terms? It wasn't freedom, but it was a chance. It was more than Malcolm had dared hope for. I accept, he said without hesitation. Thank you for this opportunity. I won't waste it. Do not thank me yet, Goyakla said through Desba, his expression stern. Our life is hard, our enemies many. Winter in these mountains kills the unprepared. You may wish you had chosen differently before the year ends. You may dream of your soft bed and your easy life and wonder why you ever left it for this. I won't, Malcolm said with conviction. Whatever hardships come, they're worth it. She's worth it. The chief's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a slight relaxing around his eyes that might have been approval. We shall see. Time reveals truth better than any words. The council dissolved, people returning to their daily work with the matter settled. Warriors released their grip on weapons, though their watchful eyes remained on Malcolm. Nalin rushed forward, and Malcolm caught her in his arms, holding her as though she might disappear if he loosened his grip even slightly. You did it, she whispered against his chest, her voice thick with relief and joy. You stood before them and did not break. You spoke truth and they heard it. I had to. For you. For us. For any chance at a future together. She pulled back, her eyes searching his face, her hands framing his jaw. A year is a long time, and it will not be easy. My father will test you, he said as much. The warriors will challenge you to prove your strength and courage. Some will always see you as enemy, will wait for you to fail so they can say, see, all white men are the same. I know, Malcolm said, touching his forehead to hers. But we have time now. Time to prove that different people can build something together. Time to show that walls can become bridges, that enemies can become family, that the future doesn't have to repeat the past. Goyakla approached, his face still stern, but something like respect flickering in his eyes. He spoke in Apache, his tone formal but less hostile. Nalin translated, My father says you may stay in my mother's sister's wickiup. Her husband died 2 winters past, and she has space. She will teach you our ways, our language. You will work with the hunters, learn to move through these mountains without leaving signs that soldiers can follow. If enemies come, soldiers or rival tribes, you will fight beside us or be judged complicit with them. There is no neutrality in war. You choose a side by your actions. I'll fight beside you, Malcolm said firmly, looking Goyakla in the eye. I chose my side when I chose Nalin. That choice doesn't change based on convenience. Goyakla studied him for another moment, then did something unexpected. He extended his arm. Malcolm understood the gesture and gripped the chief's forearm warrior style, feeling the strength in those weathered muscles. They stood that way for a moment. 2 men from different worlds, acknowledging each other's courage across a divide centuries deep. When Goyakla walked away, Nalin laced her fingers through Malcolm's, and he felt the simple joy of being allowed to touch her openly. Without hiding, without fear, come, she said, pulling him gently. I'll show you our home. They walked through the camp together, and Malcolm noticed the subtle shifts in how people regarded him. Children peeked at him with curiosity rather than fear. their innocent eyes seeing simply a stranger, not an enemy. Women nodded in acknowledgement as they passed, some even offering small smiles. Warriors gave space without hostility, though Malcolm knew he would need to prove himself to them individually over the coming months. Nalin's aunt, a woman named Kimmy with kind eyes and capable hands, greeted them at her wickiup. She spoke no English, but communicated welcome through gesture and expression, showing Malcolm where he could place his few belongings, offering him water and food with the hospitality due to a guest. That evening, as the sun set fire to the mountain peaks and painted the valley in shades of gold and purple, Malcolm sat outside the wickiup, watching the camp come alive with evening routines. Fires were lit, meals prepared, children called in from play. Nalin worked beside her aunt, preparing food with practiced efficiency, her laughter rising above the sounds of daily life. She caught him watching and smiled, and Malcolm felt something he hadn't experienced in years, peace that went bone deep. Quieting anxieties he'd carried so long, he'd forgotten life without them. A sound from the edge of camp made him turn. From the tree line, a black shape emerged from the shadows, unmistakable even at a distance. Thunder. The stallion walked forward calmly, his coat gleaming in the fading light, his eyes bright and knowing, his gait unhurried, as though he'd been expected. Malcolm stood slowly, hardly daring to breathe, afraid that sudden movement might send the horse bolting back into the wilderness. Thunder approached with the confidence of an animal that had never known true domestication, that had chosen his interactions with humans rather than having them forced upon him. The stallion stopped a few feet away, regarding Malcolm with those intelligent eyes. Malcolm reached out slowly and Thunder lowered his head, allowing Malcolm to touch his neck, to feel the warmth of his coat, the steady pulse of life beneath his palm. "You brought her to me," Malcolm whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Somehow you knew. You walked into that desert, found a dying woman and led me to her. Then you distracted the soldiers so she could escape. I don't understand how or why, but thank you. Thank you for giving us this chance." Thunder nickered softly, a sound that seemed to carry agreement or acknowledgement, or perhaps just affection for this human who'd once gentled him with patience instead of force. Then the stallion lifted his head, turned, and walked back toward the forest with the same unhurried grace. Malcolm watched him dissolve into shadows and mystery, becoming one with the wilderness that had birthed him. Naylin joined Malcolm, slipping her hand into his, her presence warm and solid at his side. He came to say goodbye, or to make sure we made it. To see his work completed. Perhaps both. She leaned against him, and they watched the place where Thunder had disappeared into the darkening forest. My people have a saying, some spirits walk on 4 legs, teaching us what we need to know when we are ready to learn. Thunder was that for us. He appeared when we needed him most. Malcolm wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. What did he teach us? That unlikely things are possible when we have courage to believe in them. That strangers can become family if we let down the walls we build. That sometimes being lost is the only way to be found, because we don't know what we're searching for until it appears before us. As darkness claimed the valley and stars emerged in impossible numbers, more than Malcolm had ever seen from his ranch, where dust and distance dimmed their light. He felt the pieces of his broken life beginning to form something new. Not what he'd planned or expected, not the future he'd imagined when he built that adobe ranch house with Sarah, but perhaps something better, a life built on choice rather than circumstance, on love rather than loneliness, on bridges rather than walls. The journey ahead would be difficult. A year of proving himself, of learning a new language and customs, of earning the trust he'd been granted conditionally. Winter would test his endurance, the warriors would test his courage, and every day would require him to demonstrate that his words had substance. But standing here with Nalin, surrounded by mountains that had witnessed centuries of struggle and survival, Malcolm felt ready for whatever came. He had lost a horse and found a woman, lost a ranch and found a home, lost his old life and found a reason to build a new one that mattered beyond simple survival. And somewhere in the wilderness, a black stallion ran free under the same stars, his work complete, his purpose fulfilled, carrying the mystery of how animals sometimes know what humans cannot, that the lost must be found, that the broken can heal, and that love, when it's real, will always find a way through the darkness into light. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.